The streets of Clearwater, Florida, were unrecognizable that morning. The city that Hulk Hogan had called home for decades seemed to hold its breath. Traffic slowed to a crawl. The usually bright and sun-drenched sidewalks were lined with mourners in bandanas and wrestling t-shirts, and the salt air coming in from the Gulf carried an unmistakable heaviness. From the outside, it looked like the kind of send-off you'd expect for a man who had been larger than life, both inside the wrestling ring and beyond it. Cameras from local news stations panned across the crowd, capturing the sea of red and yellow, the Hogan merchandise worn like armor by fans who had come from all over the country. But the truth, the moments that mattered most, happened away from the main stage, away from the camera's zoom lenses. That's where this story begins. The official funeral program read like a standard celebrity farewell. A public procession down a blocked-off section of Cleveland Street, followed by a private memorial service at Hogan's Clearwater mansion. But even before the first limousine arrived, there were signs that this wasn't going to be an ordinary goodbye. A select few, mostly old friends, former wrestlers, and family members, were seen arriving hours before the scheduled time, entering the mansion through a side gate guarded by private security. Each was instructed to leave phones and cameras in a secure area inside, a move that puzzled even some of Hogan's closest confidants. He wanted it to be real, one insider would later reveal. No staged shots, no social media moments, just people, their words, and their memories. The public portion began with a slow drive of the hearse, its windows tinted dark enough to obscure the casket from view, yet light enough that the gold trim around its edges glimmered in the Florida sun. Fans erupted into chants of "Hogan! Hogan! Hogan!" But their voices cracked with emotion. For many, this was the first time they had truly accepted that their hero was gone. There were grown men in their 50s wiping tears with the back of their hands, children who had never seen Hogan wrestle live but had heard endless stories from parents and grandparents, and a few quiet faces in the crowd who seemed detached from the spectacle, as if they were there for something more personal. What television didn't capture was the strange silence that would settle over the street in between the chants. It was as if the crowd collectively realized that no matter how loud they cheered, no matter how many times they yelled his name, Hogan wasn't going to come strutting out from behind the curtain this time. That realization hit harder than anyone expected. Some turned away from the road entirely, leaning on the shoulders of friends, unwilling to watch the hearse roll past. When the vehicle reached the gates of Hogan's property, the real story began to unfold. Beyond those gates, on the sprawling grounds of his mansion, a carefully orchestrated but deeply personal ceremony was taking place. The setting wasn't what many imagined. There were no extravagant floral arches or towering arrangements. Instead, the garden had been stripped back to simplicity: a single white canopy tent, a modest platform draped in black cloth, and rows of wooden chairs, each with a small white towel folded neatly on the seat. A nod to the towel Hogan often carried over his shoulder in his early wrestling days, those invited to the private service described an atmosphere unlike any other funeral they'd attended. It wasn't sterile or overly formal. It felt like stepping into a piece of Hogan's life, where the line between his public persona and his private self blurred. His wrestling boots were placed at the foot of the platform, scuffed and worn from countless matches, alongside a championship belt that gleamed under the filtered sunlight. A single spotlight, brought in specifically for the occasion, illuminated these items, making them the centerpiece of the entire ceremony. The first shock of the day came before the eulogies even began. Linda Hogan, Hogan's ex-wife, arrived quietly, escorted by 2 security guards, and took a seat in the front row. The two had been estranged for years, their divorce famously messy and public. But on this day, none of that mattered. Witnesses say Linda kept her eyes fixed on the boots and the belt, her hands clasped tightly together. She didn't speak to the press, didn't acknowledge the cameras outside. Whatever she was feeling, it was hers alone. One by one, people stepped forward to speak, not just about Hulk Hogan, the wrestling icon, but about Terry Bollea, the man behind the mustache. Former WWE and WCW colleagues shared stories that had never been told publicly, some humorous, others gut-wrenching. One longtime friend recalled a moment from the mid-80s when Hogan, at the peak of his fame, secretly flew cross-country to visit a sick child in a hospital after hearing about him through a fan letter. He didn't bring cameras, didn't make it a publicity thing, the friend said, his voice breaking. He just sat with that kid for hours. That's the man I knew. The ceremony's most emotional moment, however, didn't come from a planned speech. It happened in between eulogies, when a soft acoustic version of Real American began to play. Everyone expected the classic song to be upbeat, the way it had always been in the arenas. But this stripped-down version, played on a single guitar with no drums, was almost haunting. It wasn't a celebration of victory this time, it was a farewell. Several attendees stood silently, heads bowed, as the lyrics they had once shouted at wrestling events took on an entirely new meaning. Outside the mansion, reporters waited for details, unaware of what was unfolding just beyond the walls. What they didn't know was that at the end of the service, a small group was invited to walk with the family to a secluded part of the property where Hogan's ashes would be interred. This was not part of any public plan. The location, under a sprawling banyan tree Hogan had planted himself more than 2 decades ago, was chosen specifically because it had been his favorite place to sit in the evenings, long after the cameras were gone. As the urn was placed into the ground, a handful of attendees whispered their final goodbyes, some touching the tree's roots as if it could somehow carry their words to him. The tension in the air wasn't just about grief. There was also an undercurrent of unresolved history among some of the attendees. Old rivalries, both professional and personal, resurfaced in subtle ways. A few former wrestlers who hadn't spoken in years found themselves seated side by side, exchanging awkward glances before eventually shaking hands. Others kept their distance entirely, standing alone near the edges of the garden. If Hogan's passing had done anything, it had forced these figures, bound together by decades of shared history, to confront the reality that their time, too, was moving faster than they cared to admit. Perhaps the most surprising moment came as the sun began to set. Just when it seemed the ceremony was over, one of Hogan's closest friends stepped forward with something in his hands, Hogan's old red and yellow feather boa. It was frayed, the colors faded from years of use, but it still carried the same flamboyant energy. Without saying a word, he draped it over the championship belt at the front of the platform. There were no speeches, no applause. Just silence, the kind that carried more weight than anything else said that day. After the private service, guests slowly filtered out, slipping past the press without stopping. But those who had been inside carried something with them that couldn't be captured in headlines, the sense that they had been part of something deeply personal, something stripped of the pageantry that often surrounds celebrity funerals. What the public saw was a hero's farewell. What they didn't see was a gathering of people, many of them with complicated histories, united for one final moment by the man who had shaped all their lives in some way. Yet even as the last of the guests departed, the story wasn't over. Inside the mansion, a much smaller group remained. They gathered in Hogan's private den, a room filled with memorabilia, photos, and personal mementos that never made it into public displays. This was the real heart of the man. Polaroids from the 80s, handwritten notes from fans, and framed drawings made by his children. It was here, in this dimly lit room, that the conversations shifted from public legacy to private memories. There were tears, yes, but there was also laughter, the kind that comes from remembering the man as he truly was, away from the lights and the roar of the crowd. It was in that space that one final, shocking detail emerged, something that might change how people remember Hulk Hogan entirely. According to one family friend, Hogan had left behind a sealed letter addressed not to the public, not to his fans, but to a single individual in the wrestling world, someone with whom he had famously fallen out. No one outside that room knows exactly what was written or who the letter was for, but the whispers that began in that den have already sparked speculation that Hogan's final message might hold confessions, reconciliations, or truths that could reshape his legacy. By the time the last light in the mansion went dark, Clearwater had returned to its quiet coastal rhythm. The public saw the flower arrangements, the procession, the chants, and the flags at half-mast. They saw the celebration of a wrestling icon. But they didn't see the moments that mattered most: the worn boots at the foot of the platform, the haunting guitar version of Real American, the ashes under the banyan tree, the feather boa resting on the championship belt, and the sealed letter that could still send shockwaves through the wrestling world. Those moments are what made this farewell unlike any other: intimate, raw, and unforgettable. And as the days pass, it's becoming clear that Hogan's funeral wasn't just the end of a chapter in wrestling history. It was the start of a new story, one that will continue to unfold in the quiet revelations, private reconciliations, and whispered truths that only a select few witnessed. And that the rest of the world is only beginning to piece together. What happened after the guests stepped out of Hulk Hogan's Clearwater mansion was not the kind of closure anyone expected. In fact, some would say the real weight of the day didn't hit until the crowd outside had dispersed, the TV crews had packed up their tripods, and the roar of Hogan had faded into the Florida night. Inside, the mansion was quiet, not the respectful hush of a formal event, but the heavy, pressing silence of a place where people were still deciding whether to speak at all. The few who remained were the ones Hogan had trusted most in life: close friends, blood family, and a select number of his wrestling brothers who had seen him through the rise, the scandals, and the painful later years. They were seated not in the grand living room or the formal dining space, but in a smaller, low-lit den tucked away at the back of the house. This room wasn't made for show. It was the most private corner of Hogan's world, the walls covered with framed photos of moments the public never saw: Hogan with his kids on fishing trips, playing guitar in sweatpants, laughing in kitchens and backyards instead of arenas. The air smelled faintly of cedar and old leather, the kind of scent that settles in when a man spends decades building a space just for himself. On the coffee table sat the urn from earlier, the one they'd placed under the banyan tree during the ceremony. It was temporary, a symbolic placement for the public goodbye. Hogan's final wish had been that his ashes be split between two locations: the tree he loved in Clearwater and another spot known only to his children. That decision alone had caused tension within the family. Some felt he should rest entirely in one place, a single site fans could visit. Others insisted on honoring his personal request, even if it meant keeping part of him hidden from the world forever. The debate had been left unsettled until now, and tonight they were finally going to address it. But before that discussion could even begin, one of Hogan's oldest friends, a fellow wrestler from the territory days, his face lined from decades of hard living, stood up holding a small wooden box. It wasn't ornate, just a plain box with a brass latch. He looked around the room, hesitating for a long moment before saying, This is from him. It's not mine to keep." He set it down on the table, sliding it toward Hogan's eldest child. "It's addressed to someone. Not me. Not you. But it's for us to deliver." The brass latch clicked open, and inside was a sealed envelope, thick with several folded sheets of paper. The front bore a single name, handwritten in Hogan's unmistakable blocky penmanship. It was a name that sent a ripple through the room. A name tied to one of the most infamous falling-outs in wrestling history, a man Hogan had not spoken to in more than 15 years. Those present didn't repeat it out loud, not yet, but their expressions told the story. It wasn't just an old colleague. This was someone who had once been family to him in every sense but blood. Someone who had been in the ring with him during his most iconic moments, and who had later been at the center of betrayals that still made headlines in wrestling circles. The decision of what to do with the letter instantly became the room's unspoken tension. Some argued it should be given immediately, exactly as Hogan wanted. Others feared the fallout if its contents were made public. "If it's a reconciliation, let it be," one person murmured. "But if it's something else, we're talking about shaking the foundation of the business, of his legacy." The box was placed back on the table, and for the moment, no one touched it again. What struck those in the room was that Hogan had chosen to keep this private. He could have made a public statement, issued a grand, final promo to the fans he loved. But instead, he had written something for one person, a conversation in ink, meant to happen without cameras, without crowds. It was a reminder that even legends die with unfinished business. And perhaps it was his way of controlling one last chapter in a life that had been lived so publicly. As the conversation shifted, other truths began surfacing. Hogan's attorney, who had been quietly seated in the corner all day, revealed that the will included instructions for an unannounced donation to a youth wrestling program in Tampa, one he had supported anonymously for years. He didn't want credit for it. He didn't want his name on a building or a plaque. The money, a substantial sum, was to be given directly to cover training costs for underprivileged kids. He said wrestling gave him everything, the lawyer explained. And he wanted to give something back that didn't involve a spotlight. It was in moments like that when the room seemed to loosen, as if the grief had briefly given way to pride. They started sharing stories that spanned decades, from the smoky bingo halls of his early career to the pyrotechnic chaos of WrestleMania main events. Some were funny in a way only wrestlers could appreciate, stories about missed cues, botched moves, and absurd backstage pranks. Others were more somber, tales of late-night conversations where Hogan spoke about the crushing weight of keeping his public image alive while his personal life crumbled. But woven into these conversations was an awareness that not everyone had been invited to this inner circle tonight. There were notable absences, former colleagues and friends who had arrived in Clearwater for the funeral but were quietly turned away from the private gathering. The reasons varied. Some had burned bridges too badly to repair. Others were kept out because Hogan himself had made it clear who he wanted there in his final moments and who he didn't. That exclusion created its own ripple effect outside the mansion. By the next morning, rumors would be swirling about who had been left off the list, and why. Back in the den, the sealed letter still sat on the table like a live charge. As the night wore on, a quiet decision was made. It wouldn't be opened here. The responsibility to deliver it would fall to one person, chosen by Hogan's children. It would leave Clearwater with them, its contents remaining a mystery, at least for now. Whether it would ever see the light of day or remain a private conversation between two men was something no one could predict. What could be predicted was the reaction if the truth ever came out. If that letter contained an apology, it could heal one of wrestling's longest-standing grudges. If it contained accusations or confessions, it could just as easily tear open old wounds. The uncertainty hung over the room like the Florida humidity outside, thick and impossible to ignore. As the hours slipped by, the group began to scatter. Some left to catch red-eye flights, others to return to hotels. A few stayed until the early hours, unwilling to let go of the moment, as if leaving the mansion meant admitting the day was truly over. The final ones out were Hogan's closest blood relatives, who paused at the doorway for one last look at the den. The boots were still on display from earlier, the belt gleaming faintly under the low light, and the boa, frayed and bright, draped across it. For all the trophies, all the accolades, those three things seemed to carry more weight than anything else. They weren't symbols of victory anymore. They were symbols of a life lived fully, messily, and unapologetically. By the next morning, Clearwater had returned to its slow coastal rhythm. Tourists walked the beach. Shops opened their doors. But for those who had been inside the mansion that night, the city felt different. They carried with them the knowledge that Hogan's funeral was more than the public saw. It was a web of private truths, unspoken reconciliations, and one sealed envelope that might still have the power to change the way the world remembers him. And somewhere, in the middle of that web, was the understanding that this wasn't just a farewell to Hulk Hogan, the character. It was a farewell to Terry Bollea, the man, a man who had given the world his larger-than-life persona, but had kept the most important parts of himself guarded until the very end. In the days that followed Hulk Hogan's funeral, Clearwater felt like a place caught between celebration and mourning. On one hand, there were the glowing tributes, TV specials, highlight reels of his greatest matches, emotional tweets from wrestlers past and present. On the other, there was a hum beneath it all, a persistent buzz of curiosity about what had really gone on inside those gates after the cameras stopped rolling. The public knew about the procession, the ashes under the banyan tree, the stripped-down version of Real American, but whispers had begun to circulate that something else had happened, something no one was talking about in full. Those whispers found fertile ground online. Wrestling forums lit up with speculation, Reddit threads stretched hundreds of comments deep, and YouTube creators began churning out videos titled "The Truth About Hogan's Private Funeral" and "What They Didn't Tell You." At the center of every rumor was the same detail: a sealed letter, allegedly left by Hogan, addressed to someone he hadn't spoken to in years. No one could confirm it outright, not yet, but the story had legs. A Florida-based reporter, known for covering the wrestling scene for decades, claimed on a podcast that two separate sources from inside the mansion had mentioned a piece of unfinished business that Hogan wanted handled after his death. The reporter didn't name the recipient of the letter, but his tone suggested it was a figure with enough history to shake the foundations of wrestling nostalgia if the contents ever came out. That was all it took for speculation to spiral. Names were thrown around recklessly. Former tag partners, old rivals, even executives Hogan had clashed with in the late WCW years. Meanwhile, the people who had actually been in the den that night were dealing with a different kind of fallout. Some were furious that news of the letter had leaked at all. It was meant to be private, one attendee told a close friend, who later relayed the conversation to a wrestling blog. If Terry wanted the world to know what he wrote, he would have gone on camera and said it himself. That wasn't the point. It was for one person. No one else. Others believed that keeping the letter a secret dishonored Hogan's legacy. He was a showman to the end, another attendee argued privately. If that letter says what I think it says, he knew it would get out eventually. He knew it would make noise. That's who he was. The debate over the letter wasn't the only source of tension. Hogan's decision to split his ashes, half beneath the banyan tree in Clearwater, the rest to be scattered in a private location with only his children present, had sparked friction within the extended family. Some distant relatives had expected to be part of both ceremonies and were quietly upset to find themselves excluded from the second. Others, particularly those closest to Hogan in his final years, defended the decision fiercely. He didn't want a spectacle twice, a family friend explained. The first part was for the fans. The second part was for his blood. That was the line. By midweek, TMZ and several wrestling news outlets had run pieces about the funeral, mostly rehashing what had already been seen publicly. But even in their coverage, there were lines that hinted at something more. One article mentioned an exchange of personal items among close friends during the private gathering, though it offered no details. That single sentence was enough for fans to theorize that Hogan had left behind more than just the letter, maybe gifts, maybe instructions, maybe something that could explain decisions he had made in his later years. The most dramatic moment of post-funeral speculation came when an unverified Twitter account, claiming to belong to a former wrestling promoter, posted a cryptic message: "The truth is coming." Hogan's last words weren't to the fans, but to the one man who could have destroyed him or saved him. The tweet was deleted within hours, but not before screenshots spread like wildfire. While the outside world dissected rumors, those who had been at the mansion remained tight-lipped in public. They had all been asked, not formally, but with the weight of shared respect, to say nothing concrete about what happened in the den. Yet even silence can speak volumes. When one former WWE champion was cornered by a reporter after a charity event and asked if the rumors about the letter were true, he didn't deny it. He just smiled faintly and said, "Some things aren't meant for the crowd." Inside Hogan's family, the letter's fate became the subject of quiet, tense conversations. His children were the ultimate decision-makers, and they weren't in agreement. One wanted it delivered immediately, exactly as it was. The other worried about timing, about how the contents, whatever they were, could overshadow the grief and turn their father's death into another public wrestling storyline. The stalemate meant the envelope remained locked away in a safe deposit box at a Clearwater bank, untouched. Meanwhile, the banyan tree in Hogan's backyard had become an unofficial pilgrimage site. Even though the exact location of the ashes wasn't marked, fans found their way there. Some left flowers. Others left wrestling memorabilia. Action figures, ticket stubs, programs from WrestleMania's decades past. A few even left handwritten letters of their own, sealed in envelopes and tucked into the tree's roots, as if the banyan itself could somehow carry their messages to him. But as moving as these tributes were, they were also a reminder that Hogan's life had been lived in two worlds, the one that belonged to the fans and the one that belonged to the man himself. The public was still mourning Hulk Hogan, the icon in the ring. Those who had been at the mansion were mourning Terry Bollea, the flawed, complicated, private man who had loved, fought, and lived on his own terms. And somewhere in between those two worlds was that letter, the final piece of him that had yet to be revealed. As more days passed, the rumors only grew louder. Wrestling podcasts debated whether it would emerge in months, years, or never at all. Some claimed to have inside knowledge of its contents, but none could prove it. What no one could deny was this: whatever was in that envelope had already become part of Hogan's legend. Even without a single word being read aloud, it had people talking, arguing, and remembering him in ways that no match, no promo, no title belt ever could. By the second week after Hulk Hogan's funeral, the atmosphere in Clearwater and across the wrestling community had shifted from mourning into something far more restless. The tributes were still pouring in, highlight packages on WWE programming, emotional fan-made videos on YouTube, and old interview clips resurfacing on social media, but there was an undercurrent no one could ignore. It was the feeling that a storm was building, and at the center of it was that sealed envelope, still locked away in a safe deposit box under the control of Hogan's children. It wasn't just fan speculation anymore. Industry insiders were starting to talk, cautiously at first, then with a little more confidence. On one of the biggest wrestling podcasts in the country, a former road agent from Hogan's era made a thinly veiled comment that sent listeners into a frenzy. "Let's just say," he teased, "if that letter ever comes out, there are going to be a few guys in this business who won't sleep for a week. Maybe a month." He wouldn't say more, but the tone in his voice, half amused, half deadly serious, was enough to push the rumor mill into overdrive. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, Hogan's family was feeling the weight of a decision that wasn't getting any easier. Every time they met, the discussion about what to do with the letter ended the same way, in stalemate. His daughter argued for honoring their father's exact instructions, deliver it directly to the man whose name was on the envelope. His son, however, feared what the contents could do if they became public. "Dad might have meant it as closure," he said during one tense conversation, "but the media will twist it into something it's not. They'll turn his funeral into a headline circus. I'm not doing that to him." The hesitation was understandable. The name on that envelope wasn't just a person, it was a symbol of one of wrestling's deepest fractures. In the late 90s and early 2000s, that man had been both Hogan's closest ally and his fiercest rival. They had built careers together, shared locker rooms, drawn millions of dollars for the companies they worked for, and then, just as quickly, they'd become enemies. Lawsuits, public insults, betrayals on live television that bled into real life. Fans had always wondered if the animosity was entirely real or part of a long con, but those who had been there knew it was real. And it was ugly. The possibility that Hogan's last written words were meant for that man, whether as an apology, a warning, or something else entirely, was enough to send shockwaves through the industry without a single page being read. Theories multiplied. Some believed it was Hogan's attempt to make peace, to end the feud before it became part of wrestling's permanent scar tissue. Others believed it might contain accusations, details of deals, and backstage politics that had never been made public. One bold rumor even claimed Hogan had included financial instructions, promising the man a share of something tied to his estate. Outside of Clearwater, wrestling journalists began digging. One prominent outlet claimed they'd spoken to a source close to the family, who confirmed the existence of the letter, but denied that it contained anything explosive. That statement, of course, only made the story bigger. Because if it wasn't explosive, why not just deliver it and move on? While the public speculated, small cracks began to form in the code of silence among those who had been in Hogan's den the night of the funeral. One former wrestler who had been there agreed to do an interview with a niche wrestling blog, but only under the condition of anonymity. He described the moment the box had been opened and the envelope revealed. "The room went cold," he said. "Not because we didn't expect him to leave messages. Hogan was a sentimental guy when it came to people he cared about, but because of who it was for. You could feel it. Whatever was in there, it wasn't small talk. It was the kind of thing you'd only say once in your life, and only if you knew you weren't going to be around to say it in person." That same week, something happened that shifted the story from whispers to a near-fever pitch, a leak. It wasn't the full letter. No one had broken into the safe deposit box, but a single, blurry photo started circulating online. It showed the envelope resting in its box, with just enough clarity to make out the handwriting and the first letter of the recipient's name. That one letter, drawn in Hogan's bold, blocky style, was enough for thousands of fans to start connecting dots. Within hours, Hogan letter was trending worldwide. Lists of potential recipients flooded forums and social media threads. Wrestling podcasts devoted entire episodes to playing elimination games, crossing off names based on known relationships and history. It was chaotic, speculative, and, to those close to Hogan, deeply frustrating. This wasn't supposed to be a sideshow, one family friend vented on Facebook. It was his private goodbye. And now it's turning into exactly the kind of media circus he didn't want. But it was too late. The genie was out of the bottle. That Friday, TMZ ran a story claiming that multiple sources had confirmed the recipient's identity, though they stopped short of printing the name. The article also hinted that Hogan's lawyers were prepared to intervene if the letter's privacy was violated. That legal angle only fueled more speculation, with fans now convinced the contents were sensitive enough to trigger a full-scale legal defense. Meanwhile, some of Hogan's oldest colleagues began speaking out, not about the letter itself, but about the man who might have written it. Bret Hart, in a rare media comment, said, "Whatever's in that envelope, I hope it brings peace to whoever reads it. I hope it's not about money or grudges. I hope it's about forgiveness. Because at the end of the day, that's what we're all looking for when we go." Others were less optimistic. An unnamed WCW-era insider told a wrestling magazine, "Hogan loved the drama. Don't get me wrong, I respected him. But if you think he wasn't aware of the kind of fire he was playing with by leaving that letter, you don't know the man. He wanted to control the story one last time. And he's doing it from the grave." Back in Clearwater, the banyan tree in Hogan's backyard was now seeing dozens of visitors daily. Some came quietly, paying their respects. Others live-streamed the visit, talking to their followers about the mystery letter as though they were part of the unfolding investigation. For the family, it was surreal, watching their father's final resting place turn into a backdrop for internet sleuthing. The pressure to reveal the contents was mounting, both from the public and from within the wrestling industry itself. There were whispers that if the family didn't act soon, someone else might, that perhaps another copy of the letter existed, or that Hogan had confided its contents to someone before his death. Whether that was true or just another layer of rumor, no one could say for sure, but one thing was becoming clear: the longer the letter stayed hidden, the more powerful it became. It was no longer just a private farewell, it was becoming the final storyline of Hulk Hogan's life. And in the business of wrestling, storylines have a way of demanding an ending, whether you're ready to give them one or not. The breaking point came on a humid Thursday afternoon, exactly 21 days after Hulk Hogan's funeral. It wasn't planned. It wasn't part of some carefully coordinated release. It happened because the sealed envelope, the same one that had been sitting in a Clearwater bank vault under lock and key, finally changed hands. The decision to move it was made quietly, in a private meeting between Hogan's children and his longtime attorney. They'd been at a standstill for weeks, with one child insisting the letter be delivered to its intended recipient and the other digging in over concerns about public fallout. But the mounting pressure from the media, the increasingly aggressive calls from wrestling journalists, and the knowledge that someone, somewhere, had already leaked a partial image of it forced their hand. The lawyer suggested a compromise. Deliver the letter, but only under controlled conditions. No mailing, no intermediaries. It would be hand-delivered, in person, directly to the man whose name was on the envelope, and no one else would see it. The family agreed. Reluctantly. But even that decision didn't happen without argument. There were raised voices, long pauses, and finally the kind of resigned silence that only comes when everyone realizes there's no perfect outcome left to choose from. By 5 p.m., the plan was in motion. The attorney drove from the bank to a discreet office space near Tampa International Airport, where the recipient, whose identity was still being protected, had agreed to meet. Outside, the Florida sky was thick and gray, the air heavy with the threat of an evening storm. Inside, the mood was just as charged. 2 people were in the room when the letter arrived: the attorney, carrying the small wooden box it had been stored in since the funeral, and the man Hogan had written to. According to someone briefed afterward, the recipient didn't speak at first. He just stared at the box on the table, his jaw tight, as if opening it might trigger a flood he wasn't ready for. When the latch clicked open and the envelope was placed in front of him, he hesitated. For a moment, it seemed like he might not open it at all. But then, with slow, deliberate hands, he slid a finger under the flap and broke the seal. The reading itself lasted no more than 5 minutes. The handwriting was big and uneven, the ink slightly smudged in places where Hogan's hand had paused too long. No one except the man and the attorney saw the words, but what happened next spoke volumes. The recipient leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and for nearly 30 seconds, said nothing. When he finally opened them again, they were wet. He folded the letter carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and pushed it toward the attorney. "Keep it safe," he said quietly. "For now." That "for now" was all it took for the speculation machine to roar back to life. Someone inside the building, whether it was a staff member, a security guard, or someone else entirely, leaked to a journalist that the letter had been delivered and read. Within hours, the news was everywhere. The mystery letter had finally reached its intended hands, and whatever was inside had left the recipient visibly shaken. And then came the first real clue. A respected wrestling reporter, who had never once published a claim without backing, wrote that he had spoken to a direct witness, who described the letter's tone as part confession, part apology, part instruction. That single description sent shockwaves through the wrestling world. If true, it meant the letter wasn't just a personal goodbye, it was Hogan tying up loose ends in ways the public might never have imagined. Almost immediately, theories evolved. Some said Hogan had confessed to orchestrating or influencing career-altering backstage decisions that had derailed others' paths. Others believed it was more personal, perhaps an admission of regret over a friendship destroyed. And then there were those who insisted it contained instructions for something Hogan wanted done posthumously, something so sensitive it couldn't be carried out until the right time. The reaction among Hogan's inner circle was mixed. Some felt relief that the letter had finally reached its destination, ending weeks of paralyzing indecision. Others were furious that word of the meeting had leaked it all. "We kept this under wraps for a reason," one close friend told a local radio host. "Now it's going to turn into exactly what Terry didn't want, a feeding frenzy." But the truth was, there was no stopping it now. Outside Hogan's mansion in Clearwater, more fans began gathering than ever before. Some brought flowers, others carried hand-painted signs with messages like, "We'll wait for the truth," and "Hogan forever." The banyan tree became a focal point for these gatherings, its wide roots holding not just tributes, but handwritten letters from fans addressed simply to Terry. The wrestling world was watching too. On a major televised show, one of Hogan's former on-screen rivals broke character mid-promo to say, "Some things in this business should stay between brothers. But if Terry wanted the world to hear it, I hope it comes out. Because whatever it is, I guarantee it's real." And still, the contents remained locked away, both literally and figuratively. The attorney now held the letter again, stored under tighter security than before. The recipient had made it clear, nothing would be released without his say-so, but there was one more twist coming, one no one had prepared. 4.3 nights after the meeting, a short audio clip surfaced online. Grainy, muffled, but unmistakable, it was Hogan's voice. The clip was only 24 seconds long, and it was impossible to tell when it had been recorded, but the words were chilling in their ambiguity. If you're hearing this, brother, then you already know. I'm trusting you to do the right thing. Don't let them spin it. Don't let them take it away from what it's supposed to be. No one knew if the audio was connected to the letter directly, but the timing was too perfect to ignore. Fans went into overdrive, dissecting every syllable, every pause, every breath. Theories flourished, the media swarmed, and suddenly, Hogan's farewell had shifted from a private act to a living, breathing mystery gripping not just wrestling fans, but anyone who loved a good unsolved story. What was clear now was that this wasn't fading quietly into history. The letter, and now the audio, had become an extension of Hogan's final performance. The curtain might have fallen, but in true wrestling fashion, the storyline was far from over. The leaked audio clip hit the wrestling world like a steel chair to the back. It was only 24 seconds long, but in that short burst of Hogan's gravelly voice, the temperature around his funeral story went from warm rumor to white-hot obsession. Every word was replayed, slowed down, analyzed in podcasts and YouTube breakdowns. If you're hearing this, brother, then you already know. I'm trusting you to do the right thing. Don't let them spin it. Don't let them take it away from what it's supposed to be. It was vintage Hogan in tone, brother, and all, but the weight in his voice was different. There was no kayfabe bravado, no over-the-top delivery. Just a raw, almost weary sincerity, as though every syllable was chosen because he knew he might not get another chance to say it. Within hours, the wrestling media had split into factions over what it meant. The peace camp believed it was a plea for reconciliation, a sign that whatever was in the letter was meant to heal an old wound rather than tear open a new one. The bombshell camp, however, thought it was a warning. To them, don't let them spin it sounded like someone preparing the recipient for fallout, maybe even backlash, if the truth came out. And then there were the conspiracy theorists, a surprisingly large segment, who argued that the audio wasn't new at all. Some claimed it had been recorded years ago for an entirely different purpose and was now being repurposed by someone with an agenda. A few went so far as to suggest the voice might have been AI-generated to stir the pot. Meanwhile, inside Hogan's old inner circle, patience was running thin. Old rivalries that had been kept at a low simmer since the funeral now boiled over in public. On one popular wrestling podcast, a former WCW champion who'd been at the private memorial took a direct shot at another attendee, accusing him of leaking the existence of the letter in the first place. Some people in that room, he said bluntly, couldn't resist turning Terry's last wishes into a headline. And they know who they are. That accusation was answered 2 days later on Twitter when the accused fired back, calling the claim garbage and insisting the family's own indecision was the real problem. If you keep a secret too long in this business, someone else will tell it for you, the tweet read. It got nearly 500,000 views in less than 12 hours. The fracture lines didn't stop there. Two major wrestling promotions, both of which had celebrated Hogan's career in tribute segments, suddenly found themselves on opposite sides of the debate. One company's commentary team openly discussed the letter during a live broadcast, treating it as part of Hogan's final story and encouraging fans to stay tuned for when the truth comes out. The other company's executives issued a memo banning any mention of it on air, calling it a private family matter that should remain private. That divide spilled over into fan culture almost instantly. At independent shows across the country, crowds began chanting about the letter mid-match, forcing wrestlers with no connection to Hogan to either ignore it or play into it for cheap pops. On social media, hashtags like #HoganLetter and #DoTheRightThingBrother trended for days, but behind the noise, something else was happening, something quieter, more strategic. The recipient of the letter, the man whose identity was still officially unconfirmed, had begun reaching out to a few trusted allies. These weren't interviews or public statements. They were private phone calls and in-person meetings, and the people on the receiving end all came away with the same impression. He was weighing whether or not to go public. One of those allies, a respected veteran who'd worked in multiple major promotions, later confided to a journalist off the record, "He's torn. Part of him wants to honor the privacy. The other part, well, the other part knows Terry wouldn't have put this in writing if he didn't want it to mean something to more than one person. The industry's appetite for answers was becoming impossible to contain. Promoters, agents, and wrestlers who'd spent years navigating Hogan's outsized influence in the business knew that a revelation from him, even posthumously, could shift narratives about some of wrestling's biggest moments. Bookings, title reigns, storylines that had defined eras. All of it could be reframed in light of whatever was inside that letter. The tipping point came when a third leak hit the internet. This time not an image or audio, but a text excerpt. It was only a fragment, just 8 words, supposedly transcribed from the letter itself. I should have told you back in '98. That single line detonated like dynamite. 1998 was one of the most pivotal years in wrestling history, the height of the Monday Night Wars, the peak of the NWO storyline, the year when backroom politics were shaping television more than ever. Fans and insiders alike immediately began combing through that year's events, looking for the moment Hogan might have been referring to. Some pointed to a controversial match finish in WCW that had left one top star humiliated on live TV. Others guessed it was about a business deal that had soured. A few whispered about personal betrayals that had nothing to do with wrestling at all. The family issued a terse statement through the attorney. Any alleged excerpts being circulated online are unauthorized, unverified, and disrespectful to the privacy of the Bolia family. But the denial only fueled speculation that the fragment was real. By now, the letter was no longer just a private farewell. It had become a cultural flashpoint in wrestling. It was being discussed on sports talk shows, covered by mainstream news outlets, and debated endlessly in fan communities. Every day it stayed hidden. The demand for it grew louder, and in the middle of it all, the man who held the decision in his hands was running out of time to control the narrative. He knew that if someone else leaked the full contents without his consent, the story could spin beyond repair. He also knew that if he released it himself, it would be the single most talked about event in wrestling since Hogan's retirement. Maybe even bigger. What he didn't know, what no one knew, was that forces outside the family were already moving to take that choice away from him, because somewhere, in a dimly lit back room of a Las Vegas memorabilia shop, a copy of the letter had surfaced. And the person holding it wasn't interested in wrestling history or family wishes. They were interested in one thing: cash. The Las Vegas memorabilia shop didn't look like the kind of place where a story that could shake the wrestling world would break wide open. It was a narrow, dimly lit storefront tucked between a pawn shop and a tattoo parlor. The kind of place tourists wandered into on a whim after losing a few bucks on the slots. Its dusty glass cases were filled with signed trading cards, vintage concert posters, and an odd mix of wrestling collectibles, old programs from the '80s, replica belts with fading signatures, and yellowing VHS tapes of pay-per-views long since forgotten. But in the back, behind a locked door marked Private Inventory, sat something no one outside a handful of people in Clearwater was supposed to have. A copy of Hulk Hogan's letter. It wasn't the original, but it didn't need to be. The man who brought it in, whose name the shop owner refused to give, claimed it was a scanned duplicate made before the envelope ever left Clearwater. He wouldn't say how he got it, only that a friend of a friend owed him money and payment had come in the form of this one digital file. And now he wanted to cash out. The shop owner, a wiry man with a habit of overvaluing every piece of merchandise in his store, immediately recognized what he was holding. Even without reading the full thing, he knew a Hogan artifact tied to the funeral letter could command a small fortune from the right buyer. But this wasn't the kind of thing you put in the front display case. This was a whisper sale, the kind of transaction where money changes hands in private and no one ever admits it happened. Within 48 hours, word had reached a handful of wealthy collectors, the type who already had original NWA belts in climate-controlled vaults and could write six-figure checks without blinking. But word also reached people inside the wrestling industry. Executives, journalists, even a few old rivals of Hogan's who understood exactly how dangerous the letter could be if it was the real thing. That's when the bidding war began. At first, it was quiet phone calls, encrypted messages, Private offers that were as much about control as they were about ownership. For some, getting the letter meant protecting Hogan's legacy. For others, it meant controlling a story that could embarrass or implicate them. But as more people got wind of it, the price skyrocketed. One anonymous offer reportedly hit $250,000. Another came from a media company with plans to build a documentary series around the letter and its fallout. A third, unverified bid came from a former wrestling promoter who promised to leak it all online for free if he got his hands on it, not out of malice, but, as he put it, because the fans deserve to know. Back in Clearwater, Hogan's family got the call they'd been dreading. Their attorney confirmed the copy existed and that it was making the rounds in Vegas. The room fell into a stunned silence. The recipient of the original letter, the one who'd been agonizing over whether to release it, reportedly slammed his hand on the table hard enough to rattle coffee cups. "That's it," he said. "We don't get to choose anymore." From that moment, the clock was ticking. If someone else broke the story first, they'd lose all control over the context, the framing, the truth. And with the Vegas copy floating around, it was only a matter of time before someone paid enough to make it public. 3 days later, the inevitable happened. It wasn't a press conference. It wasn't an official family statement. It was a midnight post on a popular wrestling news site, accompanied by a grainy photo of the first page and a full transcript of the letter's contents. The watermark in the corner, "Private Collection, Las Vegas," left no doubt where it had come from. And, just like that, the world finally knew. The letter began with Hogan calling the recipient, "my brother," in ways the blood never gave us. It was an acknowledgement of their history, the highs of the business they'd built together, and the lows of the betrayals that had driven them apart. Then came the confession. "Back in '98, I made a call I never should have made. It wasn't about the business. It was about me. I was scared of losing the spot, scared of losing the crowd. So I buried you in that meeting. You know the one. I told them you weren't ready. I told them you were trouble. And I watched as you lost everything you'd worked for. I told myself it was just the game we play, but that was a lie. I did it because I couldn't stand the idea of you taking my place." The words were blunt, almost brutal in their honesty. Hogan didn't try to soften them. He admitted that his actions had cost the recipient millions of dollars in potential earnings, championship runs, and mainstream opportunities. He admitted that the fallout from that decision had permanently altered the trajectory of the man's career, and then came the apology. "I can't give you those years back, brother. I can't undo what I did. But I can tell you the truth before I'm gone. You deserved better from me. You were the better man then, and I see that now. If this letter does anything, I hope it lets you breathe a little easier. I hope it tells the world the truth when I'm not here to say it." The final paragraphs were part instruction, part plea. Hogan urged the recipient to decide for himself whether the letter should be shared publicly. But he warned him, don't let them spin it. Don't let them turn it into a headline about ego or politics. This is about owning what I did and making sure my last words to you aren't silence. By the time the letter ended, signed simply Terry, the wrestling world was in chaos. Fans who had idolized Hogan for decades were forced to reconcile the larger-than-life hero with the man who'd just admitted to sabotaging another's career. Some were angry. Others respected the honesty. Many saw it as proof that wrestling's biggest icons had always been human, flaws and all. The recipient issued a short statement the next day. He confirmed the letter's authenticity, condemned the Vegas leak, and said he'd hoped to release it when the noise around Terry's passing had quieted. But he also acknowledged that maybe this was the way it was always going to happen: messy, loud, impossible to ignore. In Clearwater, the banyan tree became more than just a memorial site. Fans began leaving letters of their own, confessions, apologies, thank yous, tucked into its roots in tribute to Hogan's final act of truth-telling, and in the end, the letter did what Hogan had always done best. It got people talking. About him. About the business. About the complicated, often brutal world behind the curtain. It was a final promo, written not for the cameras, but for one man and now for everyone. In the weeks after the letter's release, Clearwater felt different. It wasn't just the media trucks that had long since gone, or the thinning crowds outside Hogan's mansion. It was the way people spoke his name now. There was no longer the unbroken illusion of the hero in red and yellow. There was the man, Terry Bollea, in full, a titan in the ring, a flawed human outside of it, and in his final act, someone who'd chosen truth over the comfort of myth. Those who had been there on the day of the funeral began to see the whole day differently. The moments that had seemed small, almost invisible at the time, now pulsed with meaning. The way his championship belt and worn boots sat on the platform, not as trophies, but as relics from a career that had given him everything and cost him just as much. The stripped-down, haunting version of real American that had filled the garden with something closer to grief than celebration. The feather boa laid gently over the belt by an old friend who hadn't said a word, as if he knew that Hogan's story wasn't about to end neatly, and there was the banyan tree, when his ashes were placed beneath it. Those gathered there had thought it was just his favorite spot, a place where he'd once found peace away from the roar of arenas. But after the letter came out, people began to understand it differently. The tree wasn't just a final resting place, it was a witness. A silent keeper of the moments and decisions that had shaped Hogan's life. Strong roots and sprawling branches, much like the man himself, larger than life, but deeply anchored in the parts of him most never saw. Those who had sat in the den that night after the public service recalled how Hogan's private world felt then, heavy, secretive, guarded. Now, they realized they'd been sitting on the edge of a truth that would soon crash into the open. The sealed envelope on the table had been more than paper and ink. It was a ticking clock counting down to this exact shift, when the story of Hulk Hogan's life would have to make room for the reality of Terry Bollea's choices. The leak didn't erase the love people had for him, but it did something more complicated. It deepened it for some. For fans who had grown up idolizing him, the confession inside that letter stripped away the last bit of distance between them and their hero. He wasn't just the unbeatable champion on TV anymore. He was a man who had done wrong, carried it for decades, and found a way, however imperfect, to set it down before the end. The banyan tree. The tributes began to change. There were still flowers and Hulkamania shirts, but now there were folded pages, handwritten apologies from strangers, and stories from fans about times they'd let pride or fear cost them something they couldn't get back. His final act had turned the site into more than a memorial. It had become a place for people to lay down their own regrets, the way he had in that letter. Inside the wrestling world, the conversation shifted too. The debates about title runs and backstage politics seemed smaller now, overshadowed by the bigger question his letter had raised. How many other truths were being carried quietly, waiting for a moment that might never come? Hogan's goodbye had cracked the veneer of an industry built on spectacle and secrecy, showing just how human even its loudest legends were, and so the funeral day, once remembered only for its public spectacle and quiet, private ceremony, was reframed. Those who had been there now thought of it not just as the day they said goodbye to Hulk Hogan, but as the day the first page of his final chapter was turned, the one where he wrote, not for the crowd, but for the man he'd wronged. The one where the greatest showman of his era stepped off the stage and, for once, spoke without the lights in his eyes. In that sense, the funeral was never really the end. It was the moment the real story began, a story that would keep unfolding long after the chance had faded, in the roots of a banyan tree in Clearwater, and in the pages of a letter that had changed everything. The Gulf air was warm, thick with the scent of salt and sunscreen, but Clearwater didn't feel like a beach town that day. The city was quieter than usual, as if the whole shoreline had taken a breath and was holding it. Streets that were normally scattered with tourists in flip-flops and sun hats were instead lined with people in red and yellow bandanas, vintage wrestling t-shirts, and leather vests patched with logos from a time when professional wrestling ruled television. They weren't here for a meet and greet or an autograph signing. They were here to say goodbye. At the center of it all, behind the high gates of a sprawling white mansion, the most private farewell of Hulk Hogan's life was being prepared. To the world, he'd been a superhero in flesh and blood, The man who tore his shirt down the middle before stepping into the ring, who told millions to say your prayers and eat your vitamins. But inside those gates, he was just Terry Bollea, father, friend, flawed man, and for the first time, the subject of a gathering where the spotlight wasn't for hype, but for closure. The official plan was simple on paper. A public procession down a closed-off section of Cleveland Street, then a private service at the mansion. But even before the first limousine rolled in, there were signs this wouldn't be like other celebrity funerals. Hours before the public ceremony, small clusters of people, old friends, former wrestling colleagues, and family members were ushered in through a discreet side entrance. Each was asked to leave their phone and camera in a secure room inside. No recordings. No selfies. No live streams. He wanted it to be real.